What is the Book of Taliesin? The Book of Taliesin is essentially one of the great cultural treasures of Wales. It's one of the great pieces of literature that have survived down the ages. It's certainly up there with other great medieval compendiums of Welsh literature, such as the Red Book of Herges, the White Book of Rhydderch, the Black Book of Carmarthen. And the Book of Taliesin is certainly, if not an equal in terms of its size, because it's actually quite a small book, but it's certainly equal in terms of its importance. This is really the only text that gives us a clear, although mysterious, insight into the Taliesin myth at this time, which is roughly the period between the 10th and 13th century. I don't think we can really go into much detail on dating the majority of the texts, but they're roughly within that time span. Some may be a little earlier, some may be a little later. But to begin with, what does the Book of Taliesin look like? Well, it looks something like this. It's known as Penarth Manuscript number 2, which means it comes from the Penarth collection, a collection of manuscripts and writings that have their own history, which we won't go into this evening, but is still very interesting for those of you who want to go digging around. It's currently stored at the National Library of Wales, of course, in Aberystwyth. But perhaps the main feature of this all-important, historically profound book is the fact that it's actually quite small. It's not that much bigger than a Penguin Classic. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to actually go and handle the Book of Taliesin and go and work a little bit with it in the National Library. And that's the first thing that strikes you when you're looking at the Book of Taliesin, is that even though it's diminutive in form, it's quite weighty in historical importance. We are almost certain that it was copied by a professional scribe probably around 1325, possibly at Cwmhir Abbey, which is just to the north of Llandrindod-Wells in the county of Powys. This is actually quite a typical setting for the copying of not only Welsh manuscripts but also Irish manuscripts, and manuscripts across Europe were generally copied in Christian settings, usually by professional scribes who were usually monks or clerics. But it's worth bearing in mind that it is an incomplete manuscript. There's one whole quire, which is like one fold of manuscript pages. There could be anything from 4 to 12 pages in an actual quire, but there's one whole quire missing. There's one whole chunk of the text that's gone amiss, which is, of course, intriguing. Who knows what were in those pages? And even though we can't say what was specifically in those pages, we obviously have the rest of the book, so we can assume that it was the type of material that I'm going to describe for you this evening. The current standard editions for the contents of the Book of Taliesin, we've got Ifor Williams, the great Welsh scholar, who made his edition of Canu Taliesin, the poems or the songs of Taliesin, which may be the earliest poems in the Book of Taliesin. These may have been the original work of the historical Taliesin, the 6th century poet who praised Urien, one of the northern British kings back in the 6th century. Then we have Margaret Haycock, who very fortunately for us put together the prophecies from the Book of Taliesin back in 2013. This covers the prophetic poems that are composed in the voice of Taliesin. And then Margaret Haycock, we're now onto the second edition of the legendary poems from the Book of Taliesin. These are poems almost all, once again, composed in the voice of Taliesin, like the prophecies, but also like the prophecies, these are almost certainly not the work of the historical Taliesin, or it would be very peculiar for these to be the work of the historical Taliesin. they're more than likely poems composed between the 10th and 13th centuries, many of them composed during the latter parts of the 12th and early part of the 13th century, perhaps by a very famous, high-ranking chief bard, court poet by the name of Prydydd y Moch, the poet of the pigs, whose real name, of course, was Llywarch ap Llywelyn, Llywarch, the son of Llywelyn, court poet to no less than the great noble families of Wales, particularly that of Gwynedd. It's worth bearing in mind that the online translation of the Book of Taliesin that many people still quote from, which is actually a copy of Skene's Four Ancient Books, is very unreliable. I would always counsel not going anywhere near Skene's version of the Book of Taliesin. So, for example, the version that's on the Mary Jones website, which is what many people looking for a good translation of the book often use, this is a very garbled text. That's why Margaret Haycock had to go ahead and put together her edition, because there was no reliable edition before her 2007 first edition of the Legendary Poems, I think. So if you're looking for decent editions of poems from the Book of Taliesin, look at the Ifor Williams edition and the work that Margaret Haycock has been doing over the last few decades. Margaret Haycock also includes a translation in her text. The Ifor Williams edition doesn't have a translation, although there have been translations made of that edition, which you could probably find somewhere. Anyway, to move on to the interesting stuff, the actual contents of the Book of Taliesin. What we really have in the Book of Taliesin, as I said, are four different types of poetry. The first genre or type of poetry are the 12 poems identified by Ifor Williams in that first edition I was telling you about. And he reckons that these are perhaps the work of the historical Taliesin, who was praising Urien and various other early Welsh noblemen towards the end of the 6th century. But it's quite likely that those poems were handed down through an oral tradition of bardic schools, and that they were probably copied down sometime in the 9th century, if not the 10th. So we can't say that these are exactly the same poems that Taliesin composed back in the 6th century, and they may even be forgeries. But they certainly feel like poems that could have been written back in the 6th century. So this is one of the most notable poems. This is perhaps the historical Taliesin praising Urien and praising essentially the king of one of the lost kingdoms of the Old North that were eventually overrun by the Germanic tribes landing on the eastern shores and southern shores and pushing further and further north and west. But back in the 6th century, Urien was probably one of the main powers in what we now know as the north of England, and he would have been a Welsh speaker. Taliesin was probably born in mid-Wales and would have travelled up across the Brythonic-speaking territories up to Rheged in what's roughly northwestern England now. And this is part of his poem in praise of this great Welsh king, Urien. Urien of Erechwydd. Erechwydd is probably one of the regions within the Kingdom of Rheged. Urien of Erechwydd, most generous man. You give myriad gifts to the men of the world. As you hoard, so you scatter. This is really stressing the main function of many of the aristocratic families at this time, not just in Wales, but across Europe also, in that they were essentially responsible for gathering wealth and riches, stealing other people's cattle, and essentially trying to accumulate as much wealth as possible so that they could then disseminate that wealth amongst their own people. As you hoard, so you scatter. This is the basic war economy of the period. The poets of the nations rejoice for your life's duration. For as long as you live, then the poets of all of the nations will rejoice. So this is very grandiose a bit of propaganda here that Irien is so famous that all of the poets of all of the nations across the known world rejoice because Irien is still alive and we still have this paragon of great nobility, this great warrior of the Welsh. Joy is made great by such a famed hero, glory made greater by Irien and his children. So this abstract concept of glory is itself made greater because Irien and his children are alive and exist and are active in the world. So high praise there. And he a leader, an exalted chief king, traveller's patron, first in the battle hoard. That traveller's patron there may be a subtle reference to Taliesin himself, as someone who has travelled from another, what would have been a distant region at the time, that is Mid Wales, all the way up to Cumbria, essentially, to praise this nobleman who then becomes Taliesin's patron. First in the battle hoard, that is the most bravest, the first warrior to attack on the battlefield. The English know them, so these Welsh aristocracies were essentially fighting against the incoming Germanic tribes, the early English essentially. The English know them. When they speak of them, they had death and disappointments. So the English enemy have experienced the wrath of Irien and his men. Irien's men burned their lands and stole their arms. Frequent losses and hard suffering, and no relief from Irien Rheged. So Irien is portrayed as this great violent attacker of the English enemy and defender of his own people, again evoking this very basic function of aristocracy at the time. Rheged's defender, famous lord, nation's anchor, very evocative image there. I favour you, having heard of you. I favour you, having heard of you. Which is an important portrayal of Taliesin as a bard who has some kind of independence. I favour you, having heard of you. The bards this time and throughout much of the Welsh bardic tradition, they all assumed a degree of independence. We don't know how real that independence was in all circumstances, but at least the bards portrayed themselves as independent judges of men with heart, that they had the necessary awen to see the great heroic potential in the aristocracy of the time. Taliesin may well have had a certain degree of independence and portrayed himself as having a certain degree of independence of opinion. How else could this praise be fully trusted if Taliesin was nothing more than a lickspittle? Now, this also brings Taliesin, or at least Taliesin's performed persona, into the performance. And this is very important. It's one of the most subtle aspects of this poetry. It reveals bards such as Taliesin to be myth makers. Through their poetry, they're not just celebrating this mortal man, this great king, this great warrior, but they're creating and evoking a particular myth. It's the myth of the great hero. Just think of King Arthur. That's essentially what Taliesin is evoking here, this notion of a great and noble and worthy and chivalrous and violent and fair and just ruler. This isn't really a portrayal of the man himself, but is essentially an evocation of a mythic figure. And Taliesin, by stating that he favours Irien, and that's why he's come to praise him, because he's heard of him, he's heard of the great fame of this great hero. By making that claim, Taliesin is also associating himself with the myth. So here we see the beginnings of a trend that continues throughout the Welsh bardic tradition, where the bard not only mythologizes the patron, but also mythologizes himself. And this ultimately results in what we know today as the King Arthur and Merlin dynamic, if you like. There is a wise man and there is a great hero king. One is counsellor to the other. The king does great deeds in the world. The king is always out and about, righting wrongs and attacking the enemies and hoarding wealth so as to disseminate through his community and make his lieutenants and his closest allies wealthy. And the poets, of course. And then we have the poet, the wise man, the wizard, the druid in many ways. The Welsh bardic tradition at different points did refer to itself in terms of this ancient lineage of druidry. So, for example, Cynddelw Brydydd Mawr and various other poems. We find it in the Book of Taliesin even. This idea that 11th, 12th century court bards saw themselves as druids. They mythologized themselves. They called themselves derwyddon. They understood that there was an ancient lineage back in the past of priests who helped to organize the spiritual life of the people, and they positioned themselves in that lineage, which is interesting because in many ways they did perform a similar function. There's not much evidence to say that whatever the Druids believed and practiced was passed directly onto the Welsh bardic tradition, but we can assume that there would be at least some sense of continuity, that there was some continuity of practice and culture from one period to the next, although, as I said, there isn't much explicit evidence for that. So that's the first type of poetry. That's the oldest type of poetry that we find in the Book of Taliesin, this historical poetry of the actual Taliesin performing to noblemen such as Urien. And it's all pretty much in that model. It's heroic poetry. It's the heroic ideal. That's the mythology that's being evoked. And before I move on to this next genre, it's worth stressing that whoever composed this poetry originally were obviously aware of the historical Taliesin. That the historical Taliesin, through his great poetic skill, and in the Welsh his poetry is, very luminous, very tense, it has great presence. It's obvious that that poetry did survive not only in manuscript form but probably in the oral tradition also, and that poets from the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries were almost certainly required to learn by memory the poetry of great masters such as Taliesin. And it's that legendary Taliesin that informs this next genre of poetry, which is the legendary poetry that's been edited and translated by Margaret Haycock. So there are 26 legendary poems composed by unknown bards. As I mentioned, perhaps Llywarch ap Llywelyn, Prydydd y Moch, composed some of them during the end of the 12th century. And most of these legendary poems are 11th and 12th. A few are perhaps earlier and a few perhaps later. But this is one section from Angar Cyfundawd, the hostile confederacy. And I would say this is probably one of the most potent bits of writing that we have in the Book of Taliesin in terms of the more mystical aspects of the Welsh bardic tradition. And to be honest, the Book of Taliesin is one of the only sources we have for this more mystical aspect of the Welsh bardic tradition. But I'll just read for you this section in translation. This isn't exactly like Margaret Haycock's translation. I've adapted it somewhat because I have a different take on what some of these words mean. Gwilym utters, and a profound one will come. So here we have a reference to Gwilym. This is more than likely the Gwilym Bach that we find in the later folk story that was copied down around 1550, that was probably quite popular at this time. But here we have a different version of Gwilym. Gwilym is portrayed more as a magically enlightened bard who somehow causes a profound one to come through his speech. Gwilym utters, and a profound one will come. Now I think that profound one is Taliesin, that Gwilym's magical speech causes Taliesin to become present, yeah? And we could think of this in terms of the actual performance of this poem. So for example, This was almost certainly performed by a bard, perhaps not by Llawer Chap Llywelyn himself, but perhaps by one of his apprentices, performing in front of the aristocratic court in the persona of the legendary Taliesin. So pretending to be Taliesin and saying mysterious and evocative things like this. And this performing bard may have also positioned themselves as a type of Gwilym. That Gwilym is the performer uttering, thereby evoking the spirit of the great master Taliesin. Gwilym utters and a profound one will come. He would bring the dead to life, and he is poor. So Gwilym in his magical speech causes a profound one to come, and that this is bringing the dead to life. So that would make sense. The performer presenting himself in some senses as Gwilym, or as Taliesin playing Gwilym, and Gwilym bringing the dead master Taliesin back to life. Gwilym and Avagddu. Avagddu, of course, is another reference to the later folk tale that was obviously quite popular at this time too. Gwilym and Avagddu would make their cauldrons that were boiling without fire. So here Gwilym and Avagddu appear to be great magic, appear to be great sorcerers, great bardic sorcerers who are working at magical cauldrons that do not boil by the agency of fire. Of course, in another poem we hear that it's the breath of 9 maidens that causes the magical cauldron of inspiration to boil. They would work their materials for ever and ever. So here Gwilym and Avagddu are again presented as immortal figures, working over the magic cauldrons of poetry, the magic cauldrons of inspiration in the immortal realm for ever and ever. Passionately will song be brought forth by the deep, profound speaker. So this might be now the profound speaker, yeah? If you look at that second line there, the profound one, the deep, profound speaker, this might be who Gwilym has brought forth through his magical speech. Hostile is the confederacy of opposing bards. So this is the setting that the poem is performed in. The performing bard assumes that he is competing against an imaginary host of opposing bards. This is actually part of the Welsh bardic tradition, poets competing against each other. Since such a great amount of the nation's poetry was on your tongues, why don't you declaim a declamation, a flow above the shining drink? So I'm assuming that here the performing bard, who's either portraying himself as Gwilym or Taliesin, we're not sure which one at this point, maybe both, maybe there is a blurring, but at least this performing bard is challenging the imagined host of opposing bards and saying, well, why aren't you the ones who are blessing this sacred drink? And the sacred drink is very often evoked in the poetry of this period as something that's obviously part of the ritual of the court, probably mead. When everyone's separated out, I'll come with a song. Now this is my insertion here. I'm a deep one who became flesh. I'm simply going on what's been said before in the poem about bringing the dead to life. I would say that this is Taliesin now. I'm a deep one who became flesh. So I am the spirit of Taliesin who is being evoked by this this mortal bard that has become flesh. There has come a conqueror, one of the 3 judges in readiness. So Taliesin now, the spirit of Taliesin who is being channeled, if you like, by the performing bard, is referring to himself as the great conqueror. The great bard who is going to win the bardic contest. Now, very interesting. This is the material that many people are drawn to. This is the material that's notoriously difficult to interpret. Margaret Haycock has done a lot of work in presenting very detailed notes for all of these poems in her edition. And I would agree with 99% of that interpretation that Margaret Haycock presents. But I think that every now and again Margaret Haycock is a little bit too conservative. I think that we could be a little bit freer with the interpretation, particularly in sections like this, where I think this is really talking about Taliesin as an evoked spirit, if you like, that's channeled by the performing bard. That's how I would frame it, at least. There are plenty of researchers and scholars who will disagree with me, but that's how I read it. So to move on to the last genre of poetry that I just want to show to you, these are prophecy poems. So very similar to the legendary poems, very similar in style, probably coming from the same general culture of the 11th and 12th century. Again, poems composed in the voice of the historical Taliesin, perhaps to be performed in front of the court, we're not sure. But prophecy poetry, Canu-Bryd, is actually quite a long-standing genre in the Welsh bardic tradition, and this is one example of Canu-Bryd, of prophecy poetry. It's almost always political prophecy. The awen foretells that they will hasten. Now, right at the very beginning here, we have awen giving the inspired bard a vision of the future. The awen foretells that they will hasten. We don't know who they are. We're assuming the victors in this assumed prophecy. Wealth and possessions and peace shall be ours. So here it's the Welsh who are prophesied to win in this coming battle. An extensive domain and eager leaders, and after warfare settlement in every place. 7 sons from belly have arisen, Caswallon and Llydd used to cause affliction. Belly, Caswallon and Llydd are, of course, legendary figures who may have been real historical personages in the past, but have over time, through the oral tradition, have turned into these legendary heroes who are used to evoke the myth of the Welsh aristocracy here. And Welsh prophetic poetry often evokes these heroes as returning saviours. They will arise once again to deliver the Welsh nation to freedom and ensure that the Welsh reign supreme in Britain, that kind of thing. But this poetry is often very ambiguous and could obviously be used in different settings. It was obviously in support of one nobleman over another. For example, one of the more famous examples of Welsh prophecy is the genre of poetry that was written around the time of Henry Tudor and the Battle of Bosworth. Henry Tudor was actually of Welsh descent. He landed in Wales before making his way to the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 to fight Richard III. And he was presented to the Welsh as a Mab Darogan, as the son of prophecy. A returning hero, a great soul who has come back to us from the past, who's come to save the Welsh. That's how Henry Tudor was presented to the Welsh, and because of that he almost certainly gained widespread support, particularly amongst the Welsh common folk. We're not sure how much the Welsh aristocracy would buy into these prophecies. Perhaps some of them would, but they would at least acknowledge how useful political prophecy of this type was, because it almost guaranteed fame and widespread support for a particular military campaign. There is a fourth genre of poetry in the Book of Taliesin, but it's kind of miscellaneous religious verse. Some of it's relatively interesting, but I would say that those 3 genres that I've covered this evening are the most important poems that we have in the Book of Taliesin. They're certainly ones that I work most with on the courses.